Bernard Malamud has been called one of the essential Jewish American writers of the 20th century, renowned for his stories of everyday people trying to find meaning in life's struggles. But like the many drafts he was known for before finishing a story, Bernard's life was also a labored, sometimes torturous process to get where he wanted to go. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner and the difficult starts and restarts that he overcame to become a celebrated author.
It's the 1920s in Flatbush, Brooklyn. On a Sunday afternoon, an adolescent Bernard Malamud is sitting in his family's apartment above their humble grocery store on Gravesend Avenue. The Malamuds can afford little in the way of comforts. There are no books at home or much intellectual stimulation of any kind. Bernard's only exposure to culture as a child is a piano being played by an unseen neighbor heard through his living room window. He listens wistfully, longing for a life outside his poor Brooklyn enclave. Bernard's early life was characterized by struggle and tragedy. His parents were among the million Jewish refugees who fled anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and settled in New York City at the turn of the 20th century. His father, Max, had to work in their store for 16 hours every day to support the family, including weekends. His mother, Bertha, suffered from mental illness, and her condition deteriorated throughout Bernard's childhood. One day, at the age of 13, Bernard returned home to find his mother lying on the kitchen floor after drinking a can of disinfectant in an apparent suicide attempt. Bertha was subsequently hospitalized and died 2 years later, on Mother's Day, 1929. Bernard's family would never tell him the cause of death. Now a teenager with no mother, and with a father stuck in the grocery store nearly every waking hour, he felt ill-prepared to embark on adulthood. It fostered in Bernard a deep desire to prove himself, but also a gnawing fear that he could not. Perhaps to compensate for this insecurity, Bernard enjoyed being the center of attention in his social life. He was a gifted storyteller, often retelling the plots of silent movies to his friends or making up narratives of his own. At Erasmus Hall High School in Flatbush, this craving for an audience crystallized into a serious pursuit of writing, and he composed an essay about his upbringing, Life from Behind a Counter, which went on to win second place in the 1932 Scholastic Awards contest. His mind was made up. He needed to become a writer. That same year, Bernard was accepted to the prestigious City College, making the long commute from Brooklyn each day. Here he received some crucial guidance from a writing professor, Theodore Goodman. Goodman taught Bernard to avoid what he called dishonesty in writing, those contrivances and superficial narratives designed more to satisfy a writer's ego than to connect with a reader. Either you go in honest or you sink, Goodman would say. Bernard was shaken by this warning. A self-described romantic, he felt that the criticism applied to much of his own storytelling. But Goodman also praised 2 short stories Bernard had written at City College. It was a much-needed validation for the young writer, and it helped him with his resolve to push forward. Bernard graduated from City College in 1936 and began the slow, labored process to develop his writing career. For 5 years, he worked on a novel named The Light Sleeper, but the autobiographical narrative proved to be too tied to his own ego, too dishonest, in the words of his City College professor, and was rejected by every publisher he sent it to. The book was never released, and Bernard eventually burned the manuscript in his backyard. Now married with 2 children and a steady job teaching freshman composition at Oregon State University, Bernard had succeeded in having some short stories published, but still no novel. So he decided to go in a different direction, to experiment with characters and settings unfamiliar to him. The Natural, about a baseball prodigy struggling to restart his career after being shot, contained little of the autobiographical elements of Bernard's earlier writing, but perhaps coincidentally, it did mirror his life in one respect: the attempt to find success after losing years of hard work. It was an attempt that worked for Bernard. The Natural was published in 1952, with a highly successful film adaptation arriving 30 years later. For his subsequent writing, which included 2 more novels and a number of short stories, Bernard would frequently return to the familiar Jewish settings and characters of his humble upbringing. But he would also imbue some of these tales with fantasy elements and dreamlike scenarios. The result was a style unto itself, a kind of fable for the everyman. And across these fables, Bernard consistently returned to a common theme: a moral awakening arising out of tribulation. It was a theme that would reach its apotheosis in his 4th novel, The Fixer. Taking place in the twilight years of Tsarist Russia, The Fixer is about a desperately poor Jew named Yakov, who moves against all advice from a small shtetl to the city of Kiev in search of a better livelihood. Shortly after his arrival, however, a young boy is found murdered near his place of work, and Yakov finds himself the victim of blood libel, the anti-Semitic accusation of ritual murder used by Christians to attack Jews for centuries. For The Fixer, Bernard wanted to tackle larger social and political forces, in this case the anti-Semitism and revolutionary movements of early 20th century Europe. The Fixer also seems to embody Bernard's own complex views of misfortune and ambition. Yakov, after years of accepting his life of poverty, finally pushes himself to leave his shtetl and achieve something bigger, only to end up in a far worse situation than the one he had left. And yet, in the process, Yakov's plight manages to rattle Russian society and galvanize resistance to injustice. By leaving his shtetl, and by maintaining the will to live and defend his innocence, Yakov becomes one of the engines of history. It's an ambition that fails him, but one that moves the world. In 1967, Bernard Malamud won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, as well as a National Book Award for his novel, The Fixer. Notorious for his seemingly endless drafts to meticulously craft what he called the human sentence, Bernard Malamud, after years of misfortune, yearning, and self-doubt, had similarly crafted himself into a writer.
Irving Howe, another CUNY laureate from City College, once called Bernard Malamud the most enigmatic, even mysterious of American Jewish writers. Perhaps owing to his earlier insecurities, Bernard resisted the critics' attempts to label him, to describe him as only a Jewish writer, or to read too much into the autobiographical elements of his stories. One thing we can be sure of is that Bernard Malamud, the child of an unfortunate and isolated household in Brooklyn, wanted very much to be heard. Perhaps the best thing we can do then is just listen.